The first video really focused on how groups can influence our behavior, and then I finished by talking about conformity, which is sort of a passive way that groups can influence us, sometimes without us even realizing it. What I'm going to talk about next are two techniques, compliance and obedience, whereby our behavior is changed in a way that we are very aware of. So compliance, what I'm talking about here are some different persuasion techniques, some things that other people can do. Sometimes we're aware of it, sometimes we're not, but persuasion techniques whereby people can get us to change our behavior. Now, there's, I guess, two different types of categories for compliance. This first slide talks about commitment-based compliance, where we feel like we have made some kind of commitment, we want to remain consistent, and we don't want people to think that we just change our minds willy-nilly. The first technique I'll talk about is the foot in the door technique, where somebody makes a small request, you go along with it, and now they have you on the hook. You've already made a little bit of commitment to them. And so now that they know that they have you on the hook, they are able to make a larger demand on you. And typically we will accept that demand simply because we want to seem like we are a consistent person. The study that was done on this topic involved a salesperson who was in on the experiment, who was going door to door talking to stay-at-home moms. And originally he made a very small request of those women. He asked them if they would fill out a survey detailing their typical purchases that they would make for cleaning items and cooking items, sort of domestic related purchases at the grocery store. All right, so that was a small request, and the vast majority of women accepted that. Then that same salesperson came around 2 weeks later, and he said, I really appreciate that you filled out that survey for me. I'm with the same organization, and now I'm wondering if you would allow me into the house for about an hour to take an inventory of which of our products that you actually have in your home. And that's certainly a much larger request to make of somebody, to allow a stranger into your home for an hour to go through all of your things. And what the researchers found is when the salesperson just came through with that large request, they never had the women do a survey, they just, bam, started off with that large request, almost nobody went along with it. I mean, think about it. A stranger comes to your door, asks if they can rifle for you through your things, you're going to say no. But in the case where the women had initially complied with a small request, the vast majority of them were willing to let the man rifle through their things. And we see this kind of foot in the door technique being used quite often. Maybe we're asked to make a small donation, somebody comes back later and asks for a bigger donation. Maybe somebody asks you to buy something that's fairly cheap, and then they come back later, maybe with the same fundraising organization, and ask you to buy something that's a lot more expensive. And we tend to go along with these things because we want to seem consistent. The next technique is the lowball technique. This is where you agree to something that seems really simple, maybe cheap, really straightforward. But then once you have agreed, once that person who's doing the persuading has you on the hook, they keep adding things on. This is something maybe you've experienced if you've ever tried to buy a computer. You see these advertisements out there for something that is really, really inexpensive, a $299 laptop computer. Sounds great. Okay, so you log onto the website. Oh, well, then you are going to need you're not going to need to run Windows. You're going to need some kind of security software. You're probably going to want some graphics package. You're going to want a sound package. And even though you have, maybe you were only imagining that you were going to spend about $300, once you have already made that initial commitment, you're more willing to take on these additional hidden costs. And that's the lowball technique. It's one of the things that a lot of companies will do. They advertise a very, very low price. Car dealerships do this too, and then they start adding things on one after the other, and suddenly you walk out the door having spent 2, 3, 10 times as much as you were originally imagining. The general theme is that the reason why we go along with this stuff is we want to seem consistent. The next set of techniques really rely on the idea of reciprocity. I do something for you, you will do something for me. Now, the first technique of unsolicited gift, I think a lot of us are wary whenever somebody offers to do something for us for free, give something to us for free, because we have a general understanding of this phenomenon that usually something free comes with strings attached. One example of the unsolicited gift as a method for compliance is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Now, I know every year my mother would always receive a set of like return address labels and some stationery from Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And they were free. They just came, no questions asked. You didn't have to donate anything. However, this was an unsolicited gift, and certainly the goal that they had in mind, that MAD had in mind, is that my mother would reciprocate with some type of donation. I don't remember now if she donated or not. I think every year she would be a little bit exasperated that they were sending this, because then she also felt guilty. She felt like she needed to do something to return the favor. With the door in the face technique, this is kind of the opposite of the foot in the door. In this case, somebody might make an initially just ridiculous request on you, and you reject that initially ridiculous request. Well, then they do you a favor, or at least it seems like it, by bringing it down to a more reasonable request. So they just did you a favor. So then, of course, we feel compelled to do them a favor by giving in. This was a technique I used when I was doing some fundraising, both in college and then also when I was doing some political fundraising a few years ago. I would call people up and ask for an initially pretty large donation. So in the case of my college fundraising, I would usually start off at $100. Well, I was calling recent graduates of that college, and so for a recent graduate, $100 was a ridiculous request, and it was turned down. But see, then I would be kind and do those people a favor and say, okay, you're right, $100 is a little bit much. What about 20? Oh, wow, well, see, now I've done them a favor, so then they feel more compelled to do a favor back to me and give in. And so actually that door in the face technique is something I've used quite a lot when I've gone even door to door doing some fundraising. Those last slides got into compliance, where I sort of give you maybe some nudges to persuade you into changing your behavior. This next phenomenon of obedience refers to when somebody tells you that you must do something, you have to do something. They are trying to compel you to change your behavior. So persuasion is more of an encouragement, obedience is more of a demand. Now, the classic study for obedience is the Stanley Milgram experiment that was done, where there was a teacher and a learner. The book goes into it in detail, and what I have provided for you on the video links page is a link to a more modern day version of the Stanley Milgram experiment. It was broadcast on Primetime Live on ABC. And even though it was more recent, that researcher found the same basic thing that Milgram did, which is that the vast majority of people, roughly 2/3 of participants, are willing to go all the way and deliver a essentially fatal shock to somebody that they just met, simply because an experimenter tells them to. Now, as you're watching the video, I want you to consider the questions that I have up here. Why do people obey? Is there anything that might have changed a person's tendency to obey? Any way that the experiment could have been modified to make people less likely to obey? I want you to maybe think about any modern day parallels, and these are going to form the questions for your discussion board question. And one of the things I want you to be mindful of also as you're watching the video is, why do the people always turn around? They deliver the shock, they hear, ah! Why do they turn around? That's not one of the discussion board questions, but just something to be mindful of as you're watching the video. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. At the end of the last slide, when I was asking you about why people turn around, I was asking you to do something that I think we all commonly do. We try to come up with explanations for people's behavior. It's what psychologists do, and I think all of us as humans are kind of everyday psychologists. We are seeking to explain or understand the causes of people's behavior. Now, when we do that, what we're doing is making attributions. An attribution is an explanation for why somebody's doing something. All right, now I want you to imagine that somebody walks into class late. Invariably, unless we are absolutely transfixed on what the professor is saying, we're going to probably let our minds wander to why that person is late. And I can tell you as a faculty member, if somebody's routinely late, I wonder why that is. I try to come up with explanations. Sometimes they're fairly charitable explanations or attributions. I might think, oh, the person maybe had to drop their kid off late to school, or their car wouldn't start, or they had to drive really far and they got caught in traffic. Or there are other times where maybe my explanations or my attributions aren't so charitable and I'm a little bit more harsh in my head towards that person. I might think, oh, this person's lazy, this person doesn't really care about class, this person doesn't really have that much respect for their own level of performance. Any of those would be considered attributions. Now, typically what happens is when we first witness a behavior, let's say somebody who's late, our very first response, we're very rapid with this and we're very automatic, and we tend to go to those harsher, less charitable judgments. So you walk into class, the first thing I think about is, well, look at this lazy jerk coming into class. That's not very nice. Okay. Now, if I have time and energy and I'm not stressed, what will typically happen then is I will go into the second stage, which is a slower process. It's more controlled, and I tend to be a little bit more rational. And this isn't just me. This is really the general phenomenon for all people. So that first stage, I'm thinking, oh, lazy jerk. But then the second stage, I start to reason it out and come up with other possible explanations for why that person's late. Traffic, kids, car problems, etc. Now, if we are really, really stressed, we're really busy, we're really distracted, what ends up happening is we stay here. And we don't have the mental capacity to get down here and be a lot more charitable. So that's one of the reasons why when we're already stressed, we tend to be a lot more irritable, we're a lot quicker with people, and we're harsher with folks because we just don't have the mental effort to do them the favor of really coming up with alternative explanations. The next thing I want to consider is the different types of attributions that we tend to make. So what you see here is I've made up a kind of a matrix here, and don't worry about the stuff that's in here, but what I want you to pay attention to is the fact that our attributions fall along two categories: internal, external, and stable, unstable. So let me get out of here and pull up another document right here. And I've listed out a couple of the various attributions that we might make when we see somebody being late to class. And what I want to consider is with each of these, would they be a stable thing in this person's life, not likely to change, or is it unstable and kind of just a fluke for today? So if we think about car wouldn't start, well, hopefully for the person, this is an unstable issue in their life. Car's going to start tomorrow, they're going to get it fixed, whatever. Kids are sick and the person couldn't make it to school. Well, presumably, again, we're talking about another unstable attribution. This isn't going to be true all the time. Overslept alarm. Well, now this might depend upon the person. For some people, this was a fluke. Maybe they had to work all night the night before. For other folks, this might be something that happens a little more chronically. But I'll just go ahead and, for the sake of argument, type in that this one is unstable. Now think about not interested in class. Okay. If you're not interested in psychology, this is probably going to be a stable thing. It's not just a fluke that has happened today. This is something that's going to be consistent across the semester. And I would say that's probably true for poor time management. If you have trouble managing your day and how you use your time, that's probably something stable with maybe your personality. Traffic. Well, this is kind of like the alarm. Maybe it's stable, maybe it's unstable. If you routinely have to drive, down Lititz Pike during rush hour, or maybe on 11:15 outside of Harrisburg, maybe you're chronically having traffic, so I'll hit stable, and probably if you can predict the traffic's going to be there, it's something you can be mindful of in the future and leave a little bit earlier. All right, now another thing to consider is the attribution internal or external. If it's internal, then that means this is something that is completely within the person's control. External means that this is more environmental and it's not under the person's control. Car wouldn't start. Well, I think that's probably outside of our control, unless we have purposely gotten a clunker. Hopefully that's outside of your control. Kids are sick, couldn't go to school, that's external. That's not your fault. Overslept alarm. I think that probably is under your control. That is internal. Not interested in class, well, that's about as internal as you can get. That's totally under your, well, you might say it's also maybe the professor's fault, but I'm going to argue that that's under your control. Poor time management. This is another thing that's pretty internal to you, under your control. And traffic, if it's unexpected traffic, maybe, I don't know, you don't control other cars on the road, so I'm going to say that's external. Now, what typically happens is when we are really rushed and we're really stressed and we're making that first pass at our attributions, and I said before that we tend to be harsher, then we are going to take stable internal attributions for somebody's performance. So if you are late and I say, oh my goodness, you are just a jerk, you're not interested in class, you're never going to be interested in class, there's no hope. However, when I go back later and I have a little bit more cognitive resources available to me, well then I'm going to tend to be a little more charitable, and in that case I'm probably going to explain it using something that's unstable. It's not going to be consistent all the time, but most definitely I'm going to decide that it is something that is external to you. It's not entirely your fault. All right, now this distinction between internal and external will show up again, and that's why I've spent a fair amount of time on it. Now I'll return to these distinctions, internal, external, stable, unstable, and think about how we explain our performance. Now let's say you got a failing grade on a test that was important to you. Well, we each have different ways of explaining that failing grade. If you are using an internal and stable explanation, you might think, wow, I am just horrible at this. I'm not nearly as smart as I think, so that's pretty internal to you. And I'm never ever going to be very smart, so that's certainly going to be very stable. So an internal stable explanation is pretty depressing. That's pretty harsh. We might also take an internal explanation, but something that's more unstable, and just say, well, yeah, sure, I got an F on this test because I didn't study at all. Now, that's certainly under your control, so we're putting that under the internal column, but it's unstable because next time you'll study and you'll do fine. Now, what we see is that in some cases, and men are more likely to do this than women are, we will explain the behavior as being due to something that is outside of ourselves. So if you say that, well, that test was just ridiculously hard, there was no way anybody was going to pass. Okay, so then it's not your fault, it's the test's fault. So it's an external explanation. But the test is always going to be hard, so it's stable. And then the final thing would be external and unstable. I was just unlucky. It's not my fault that I was unlucky, and hopefully that's not going to be stable. It's not going to always be the case, but I was just unlucky. Now, one of the things that we see is that, as I said before, women will tend to explain failures using internal stable explanations, and they will tend to explain successes using luck, an external and unstable explanation. And this tends to be pretty harsh on self-esteem. Men, on the other hand, are more likely to explain failure using external explanations, maybe stable or unstable, and when they're successful, right over there on the ability side. So this may be one of the things that contributes to women's lower self-esteem. All right, so I said earlier that when we are observing bad behavior, lateness, failure, somebody cuts us off in traffic, and we're not feeling very charitable, we're going to tend to make internal and stable attributions for that behavior. However, if we are personally late, if I personally end up cutting off somebody in traffic, well, if I'm late, I'm not going to assume that I'm a poor time management lazy jerk. Of course not. I'm going to make some kind of external attribution for my lateness. So one of the things that we see in psychology, and this is known as the fundamental attribution error, or it's also called the actor-observer bias, I'm basically using those terms interchangeably, is that When we are explaining other people's bad behavior, we tend to use internal explanations. We tend to be harsh. But when we're explaining that very same behavior in ourselves and in people that we like, we tend to be more charitable and use external explanations. And this is known as the fundamental attribution error, because we see it in many, many places, also known as the actor-observer bias, because you would be the actor. If you're doing the bad behavior, you explain it one way. If you're observing somebody else do the bad behavior, you'll explain their behavior in a different way. And this is going to come up next week, again, when we talk about prejudice. So keep this phenomenon in mind, because we will revisit it. All right, now I've saved what's perhaps the most complex concept for last. This is the last topic that we'll talk about for this week, and that's the issue of cognitive dissonance. So dissonance refers to some kind of mental tension, and this tension develops whenever our actions and our attitudes or opinions don't match up. I would really encourage you to take a break here and watch the final video that I have listed. It's called Cognitive Dissonance. Once you have watched that, then come back to this, and I want to just discuss two examples here related to cognitive dissonance. Alright, so in that video you saw the demonstration of Festinger's classic example of cognitive dissonance, where people who were paid to lie really didn't believe their lies, because they could justify why they were lying. They got paid. And the other group, however, those people tended to lie, but they received very little reinforcement for doing so. So in that case, there was a mismatch between their actions, lying and saying that the experiment was fun, and their opinions. They didn't originally think the experiment was very fun, so there was that mismatch. And what ended up happening is they changed their opinion. They changed their opinion to believe that the experiment was more enjoyable as a way to justify all of that behavior that they did, the lying behavior. All right, so to give you an example, maybe a more real-world example, would be the reason why fraternities, sororities, military groups, church groups, there's a variety of small cultures that will use hazing. And hazing builds upon cognitive dissonance and dissonance reduction as a way to build allegiance. So with regards to fraternities and hazing, what will happen is maybe during a 2-week period, initially people don't have very much of a commitment to their fraternity. That's their opinion. It's all right. I'm interested in joining, but it's all right. However, over the course of 2 weeks, they are asked to do things that are maybe physically exhausting, that are very embarrassing, that are perhaps life-threatening with regards to drinking behavior or potential violence. They do all of these extreme behaviors. So here we have the mismatch. I feel about the fraternity, but I just potentially jeopardize my life for that fraternity. That is definitely a mismatch, and so mental tension arises of cognitive dissonance. And so, what does a person do? Well, classically what they'll do is they will change their opinion and believe, wow, there must be a really great reason why I just went through hell for the last 2 weeks. Oh, I must really love this fraternity. And so one of the nice goals of hazing is that it really can cause a strong attitude change and get people to really believe in the groups that they were pledging for. The second example that I have is the issue, oh my goodness, what did I do? Is the example of not paying kids for grades. And this really falls very closely in line with the experiment. All right, so if you recall, the people who were paid really didn't believe in what they were doing. They didn't really believe in their statement that the task was fun, because they could justify that behavior by just saying, but I got paid. The ones who weren't paid, though, came to really value the task. And so we can really apply that nicely to paying kids for grades. If a kid gets an A and then gets paid for it, they can justify all of that effort by saying, yes, look, I got 5, 10, 20 bucks. That is why I work hard. However, if we don't pay our kids for grades and they work hard, the only reason they have for working hard becomes a much more internal thing. Oh, I must really like school. I must really like this task, because there's no other reason why I would be working so hard. So actually paying kids for getting good grades can backfire and cause kids to devalue their effort and devalue the worth and importance and interest level of school, because they don't have to do that dissonance reduction. You don't pay them, they have to come up with some way to justify why they're working so hard. Why must that be? I must love school. So to just basically recap what I was giving you there, the dissonance refers to the mental tension that develops whenever attitudes and actions don't match. So we really want to get rid of that mental tension using a process known as dissonance reduction. A couple different ways we can do that are listed here, but the most common way is to simply change our attitudes. And I will leave you with this last little cartoon from Dilbert, the little dog there. Dogbert is using some cognitive dissonance and dissonance reduction to cause an attitude change in the employees. So we'll end there. Make sure you do check out the discussion board. Make sure, if you haven't already, that you watch all of the videos. The final video that's listed for 12 Angry Men pertains specifically to one of the discussion board questions, and it's only a 2-minute clip. That's all, folks.